Hello, this is Gary Watts, and I sell homes in Southern California, and I just want to give you a breakdown of an offer. Now, every offer is different, and I definitely encourage you to read through the whole thing, but I just wanted to break down the sections for you today to make it easy to understand. So let's get started. Right here, the first one in the offer is going to be the disclosure regarding the real estate agency relationship. Now, one of the things, if I'm writing an offer for you, typically it would be a buyer's agent in that sense. Now, the good thing about this is that, to highlight right here, it says that the buyer have a fiduciary duty of utmost care, integrity, honesty and loyalty in dealing with the buyer, and diligence exercise, a duty of honor, honest and fair dealings in good faith, a duty to disclose. So this is just a disclosure, basically showing of what our duty is. If you're representing both buyer and seller agent, that's the same thing. It's just a disclosure for you to sign, and you would just sign over here very easily at that sense. Also, these are the codes that basically break down all that stuff, but you can actually read through this if you wanted to. The next is a fair housing and discriminatory advisory. This is just letting you know that it has equal access to all housing for all, and various state mandates that it has. Nothing really, I mean, you can read through it, and it just gives you something to let you know what your rights are as a buyer and the equal access to housing for everybody. But nothing really to sign, or you have to sign right here, down here, but it's just a resources for you to understand. Right here, the next one is the possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, disclosure and consents. If I'm writing an offer for you, it tells you that I might be representing multiple buyers right here, prospective buyers, or if I'm working with you as a seller, it also means that I might have several listings at the same time, and it's not a sole agent for you in that sense. So also just another disclosure. The last disclosure before we get into the meat of the offer is the wire fraud and electronic funds transfer advisory, basically saying that when you transfer the funds into escrow, make sure you contact the escrow officers and call them, property managers, making sure that they got it, and don't ever wire anything unless prior to calling to confirm wire instructions. So just be careful of where you're wiring and whether those numbers are correct or not. This is actually where the residential purchase agreement and joint escrow instructions start. So first of all, you have the date that's on there. Check that your name is spelled correctly. Although it can be changed during the escrow period, it's always great to have your name checked. Also check for the address and see if it's okay. Parcel number is something that the agent should be writing for you as well. Also, right here is the offer amount that you're going to be offering. Now, right here, I put this blank for now because typically, if it is a cash offer, it would be 7 to 14 days, and then if it is a loan, it would be 30 to 45 days typically. Now, I said every offer is kind of different depending on negotiability terms and everything. Then it would be, it varies from offer to offers, but that's typically what it would be in Southern California right now. And the next one right here is talking about the disclosures of agency again. Financial terms. Now, this is where you would write your EMD or earnest money deposit right here. So your initial deposit usually is about 3% of the purchase price. So in this case, about $30K. And then now right here on this part where you have all cash or loan, if it is an all cash offer, this would be checked out right here. If it is a loan, then you would put the loan amount. Let's say if you did 20%, then you would put the $800,000 right here as your loan amount that you're getting, and then the remaining balance would change for these two right here to equal about $200,000 if you're putting 20% down, and then that would reflect in your total purchase price at this point right here. Now, verification of down payment and closing costs. This is that the buyer will, in 3 days after acceptance, deliver seller written notification of buyer's down payment and closing costs. So basically that means that after an open escrow that you would put in the down payment, which is the $30K right here. Next, you have the appraisal contingency and the loan contingency right here. Now, typically it would be 17 days for the appraisal contingency, and then for the loan it would typically be 21 days. If you're doing a cash offer, it pretty much has no loan contingency, and also you typically wouldn't write the appraisal contingency. Now, contingencies are there to show that if you cannot get the loan, let's say if you are getting a loan and you have that contingency there, then if the loan doesn't go through and 21 days later you don't get your loan approved, basically you don't have the money to close escrow, and so that would be something that you have to back out of the offer for, and therefore not purchase the house. So that would protect your deposit as well, and you would get your deposit back at that time. And that's why a lot of sellers agents would be pushing at this time when the 17 days or the 21 days goes through. Now with this is that when you have a contingency, is that contingencies have to be released. So in order for when it comes close to those 17 or 21 days, it doesn't automatically release and then your offer is in jeopardy. You would have to sign off paperwork that says you would release those contingencies. So right here on the next part, there's some addendums that might be checked off. Right here is a buyer advisory that will show up later on. These typically aren't checked off unless it is a trust, probate, or short sale in that sense, or it's a backup offer, or if there's a septic tank. All these addendums will be checked off according to each and every property. Alright, next. So the seller right here is allocation of costs. This is basically what the buyer or seller is going to be paying for at the end of the day. Right here, first one is a natural hazard disclosure. And then you have your environmental, typically usually would be checked off, and it would be seller's choice. This is just a disclosure report at the open of escrow they would get and give it to you, and showing you if there's earthquake zones, flood zones, anything like that that you as a buyer should know and be aware of when you are purchasing a house. If there's a toxic waste or something, that'll also show up there. Or actually, this is a natural hazard, so it'd most likely be like landslides maybe, or floods. And then the next one is, it's typical in Southern California where the seller pays for the termite report and the clearance. Now clearance 1, there's clearance 1 and there's clearance 2 also, but it's typical that the seller would only pay for the clearance 1, which is where when you get the inspection report, if there's any dry rot damage or damage towards the house from the wood, the seller would pay for the repairs of that, and typically the termite companies would make those repairs. It really depends on the house and how much the damage there is that it would show, but that becomes sometimes a point of negotiation as well. The buyer usually pays for buyer's inspection, and why that the logic behind that also is because you can choose your own inspector or your agents, your buyer's agents inspectors also, so you can get the advice on their side rather than on the seller's side. Then the government requires retrofit. That's basically paying for smoke alarms, carbon monoxide devices, and water heater bracing. These 3 things actually need to be installed when you're getting the appraisal, and the appraisal will check whether these things are installed. Typically they would, and that would it's just the minimum requirements that they need a lot of times for lending practices as well. Unless you're buying the house as is, a lot of times they don't even put this if you're buying the house as in all cash. Those things are mostly for the lenders to take a look at. Then it says the seller shall pay for the cost of compliance and any other minimum mandatory government inspections. A lot of times cities have city reports that they need. Every city, different cities have them, some cities don't, so you'll have to check with that. But the seller typically does pay for that and the cost of compliance with any other minimum mandatory government retrofit as well. And that's talking a lot of times about the if there's not permitted things or anything like that. But at the same time, those are points of negotiation when it comes down to it as well. Next thing, escrow and title. In Southern California, it's typical that the buyer and seller will pay for the escrow fees, 50% for the buyer, 50% for the seller as well. I usually write in seller's choice unless there's something that the buyer really would want in that sense, and the seller is okay with it. The seller also typically pays for the owner's title insurance as well. And then the county transfer fee, city council transfer fee, and if it does have an HOA or homeowners association, I would check off this one and this one as well. and this one as well if there's any private transfer fees. So, but if you're just buying a single family house, typically we wouldn't have an HOA, and but if there is HOA, make sure that your offer does have that. Next is a home warranty right here, and it's a 1-year home warranty. Now, it's somewhat of a debated process whether this warranty actually works or not a lot of times, but you do have, you know, the seller paying for $600 for the upgraded stuff. Typically how a home warranty works is that there's a fee for the home warranty company to send out someone. They would send out someone, collect a $75 fee, and then if it can be fixed, they will fix it. If it can't be fixed, they'll replace it. So not always the best service. I've looked up a lot of companies that work, you know, in terms of they contract out to different contractors, and those contractors aren't always getting the best reviews, but it is what it is. And typically I would write air conditioning, pool if there is one, and upgraded roof package with appliances as well if there is that. Okay, next is items included in the sale. Now everything is negotiable, and right here you can see existing, all these things are included, and any fixtures or fittings that are attached to a property are also included. You would have to check off the stove and refrigerator and washer if you wanted those items as well, or if there's leased or lien items, the seller shall within specified time disclose to the buyer of any items in that paragraph. A lot of this would come with like the solar panels or water treatment systems that are leased or has a lien on there. Now items to exclude is a lot of times like flat screen TVs, speaker systems, all those are usually excluded. Now if you really did want something in the house, you could look at this and say following items to include. And you know, I did have a seller where they also included a Ferrari with the sale of the house, and if you bought the house, the Ferrari to come with it. Everything's negotiable, so you can write it in pretty much anything you want at this point right here. Okay, now it says closing on possession. Buyer intends to occupy the property. If this is checked off, this means that they do not intend to occupy the property. This makes a difference only when you're getting a loan. If you don't intend to buy the property and you claim it as your primary residence, that might affect the process of your loan. So that's something to check on if you're going to be getting a loan or not. And then typically we just leave this blank if you're getting a loan and planning to occupy it, not as an investment property. Seller occupied or vacant property. This is when the seller is going to deliver the house, and typically it would write down like a certain time at a certain day, close of escrow no later than a certain amount of calendar days. If these things aren't checked off, it's okay. It doesn't have any you know, bearing or anything like that, unless the seller dictates something at the end, saying they need 3 days to 5 days or 7 days to stay in the property in order to keep on going from there. Now, we're right here on item 9C. If the seller needs to remain in possession of the property for more than 30 days, then typically this would be included in the offer also. A lot of sellers need to stay in the property for various reasons, like they can't move into their next house or they need to do something. So that is where they would need this form right here, the RLAS form. Basically, the seller would lease the property back from the buyer and pay a specified amount that the buyer and seller agreed to for that. If it is a tenant occupied property, the property shall be vacant within a certain amount of days, and that's written in the contract so that you can have the property delivered without tenants if that's what you intend, unless you are buying an investment property, or if you don't mind having the tenants stay there, you can check this and say the tenants to remain in possession of the property. Now the next one, statutory and disclosures, lead-based plant. Now from here on, there's a lot of just disclosures based off of everything, so I encourage you to read those things. You have your natural hazard, withholding taxes, Megan's Law. If you don't know what Megan's Law is, that's pretty interesting, because it says that, you know, you can go to meganslaw.ca.gov and it shows you registered sex offenders in your area also, so you could check on that as well. Also gas and hazardous liquid transmission pipelines. It also goes down to item 11, where it says the condition of the property will be, you know, it's sold as is, you know, and presented in physical condition at the date of acceptance. So that's something you should look at. Then buyer's inspections, make sure you do your inspections. Title investing, you should have a title officer make sure that the title is free and clear. Free and clear meaning that there's no liens or any holds on the property that will not really have liens that will hinder the property from being sold, and money owed to other people from it. So that's something you could check with your title officer and get more answers from that. Time period and removal for contingencies. These are usually the inspection contingencies. The seller says 7 days to give you all reports. That's the transfer disclosure and all the other disclosures that the seller might have. And the buyer right here, it could be 17 days, but I typically put 7 to 10 days for this right here. And this is where the inspection contingency. So this is the fastest contingency and the soonest contingency that will come up when you are in escrow at that point. So with this right here, you have 10 days after, and I'll kind of draw a map of the timeline of all this stuff so that you can understand in a very easy point also. Then right here, it gives the seller's right to cancel when certain things are not met or done. These offers typically tend to protect a buyer from losing their deposit if they don't perform. But if they don't release, let's say the inspection contingency or the loan contingency or appraisal, these are where the seller says have the right to cancel if they don't just go with their contingency period. They would have to deliver notice for buyer to perform, and then after that they have a certain amount of time to be able to cancel or anything like that. So notice to buyer perform, that's the NBP that they're talking about right here. And then what are the effects when you remove your contingency? It says right here, this is interesting, it says that the buyer removes in writing any contingencies or cancellation rights unless otherwise specified in writing. Buyer shall conclusively be deemed to have, number 1, completed all buyer's investigation and reviewed the reports of the transaction. Review all the reports and other applicable information and disclosures pertaining to contingency or cancellation rights. Elect to proceed with the cancellation and an inability to obtain financing. That's your loan contingency. Then right here it says close of escrow. It says that before buyer and seller may cancel this agreement for failure other than party to close escrow, and then the buyer and seller must deliver to other party demand of close of escrow. So as it's getting close to escrow, if the buyer does not close, then the seller have to give them a demand first. Then the effects of the deposits. Read through this. This is more legal jargon, but release of funds will require mutual signed agreements from both parties, judicial decisions, or arbitration awards. So typically right here, as we go down, we'll see what that represents and what that means. So all right, so next, verification of condition. Make sure you do that. If there's repairs that are needed, you should submit like a request for repair to the seller. Prorations of property tax and other items. So in California, typically taxes are paid twice a year, and if the seller has already paid for it, you would then be able to get some of that proration or be expected to pay for it also. Broker's compensation, it says buyer or seller both agree to pay the commission of the broker specified in a separate writing agreement between broker, seller, and buyer's agent as well. So typically in California, we have a 5% commission that the seller pays for, and from that the seller would pay the listing agents and pay the buyer's agent, and that would be typically 2.5% and 2.5% on there as well. So that's how the compensation usually works at the close of escrow as well, close of escrow. So in that sense, there's no fees owed during that time typically. And typically I say typically because sometimes there has been times where I found buyers great properties and from the sellers direct, and the buyers actually paid money to the buyer's agent as well. There was no listing agent, so the seller didn't want to pay, but it was at a really great price, so the buyer ended up paying the commission for that property. So everything is typical. You can write an offer anyway, but it really depends on what you're also doing. I mean, read through these things, joint escrow instructions, read through that, remedies for breach of contract. So right here, it says any clause added by the parties specifying the remedy for failure for buyer to complete the purchase in violation of the agreement shall be deemed invalid unless the clause independently satisfies statutory liquidated damage requires set forth in civil code. This, a lot of times when you're going through, like let's say the buyer decides to cancel at the last minute, and you know, you have to go through a mediation. You would first go through a mediation and then arbitration, but there is no court case in that sense. So right here it says, at the time of any increased deposit from the buyer and seller shall sign a separate liquidated damage provision incorporating the increase of deposit and liquidated damage. All these clauses, basically read through them, and it's basically showing that, you know, what happens if their escrow is canceled and, you know, some things weren't done in good faith, then that would be some remedies to that. I had a buyer basically cancel 3 days before we were supposed to cancel escrow, and he released all the contingencies already. So at that point, you know, even though he released the contingency, the sellers were entitled to get all the buyers the deposit. However, with that, they weren't able, they tried to fight for it, and actually the buyer actually got back about 75% of their deposit. So every case is a little different, and that's where they would settle mediation and then arbitration from there. So I encourage you to read through these as well. These are just terms that are going down that you can read through, and then this is where, as the buyer, you would sign this, and then the seller would sign this if they accept. Now, when you send in the offer, this is where you would sign, and if the seller accepts your offer, they would say, you know, acceptance offer, and they would put their signature here, and then that's your accepted offer. Now, if they check this right here, they would basically have a counter offer, and you have to make sure that's checked off, and then you would have a counter offer terms as well. And then that's where you would look at the seller's counter offer or seller's multiple counter offer. Now, what the difference between those are is the seller's counter offer, typically you're the only offer, you know, one offer that you would have that they're counter offering, and then, or if it's seller's multiple counter offer, that typically means that there's 2 or more offers on there, and they're making multiple offers, counter offers to different buyers as well. So that's something that you can look at. This is just the broker's information right here, and then at the bottom right here, oh, and then there's right here, yeah, so it says, right here it says, do not initial making a counter offer, confirmation of acceptance, sign a copy of signed acceptance with person who received. Sometimes they just, if you received it, they would sign that right there as well. Buyer's inspection advisory. This whole thing basically just tells you, you know, what things you should look for when you're looking at a property. You know, the condition, square footage, wood destroying pests, which are termites, soil stability, water. Now, a lot of these things are, it's very overwhelming, but you know, if the general inspection report doesn't really point out anything, then you're okay. Especially like this, a lot of people worry about this, whether it's not permitted or not, and what those effects are. If it's not permitted, there's 2 things that can happen. The city can come over and say, hey, this is not permitted, you need to get permitted, and you could pay money to get this permitted. Or the city might say, this is done so bad that you have to tear down the whole thing. So that's something that you have to look for when you're doing a permit, when you're buying a property as well, if everything's okay. Typically, if you know, you would see that if there's an addition, then it would show that, you know, you would ask those questions whether those additions were done with permits or not. So that's something to look out for. Next is the California Consumer Privacy Act. It's just a disclosure, you can read through it, and then that's next. I'm going to go over the buyer's timeline in the next video. So thank you for watching, and we'll go through this one after.